The late March sky hung like a gray shroud over the church, heavy and unyielding, matching the somber faces of those gathered inside. At the center of it all was a small coffin, its presence a stark reminder of the life that had been lost too soon. Emma's life. Daniel stood near the front, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a single rose. He couldn't bring himself to look at the coffin for too long. The pain was too raw, too overwhelming. Just days ago, Emma had been alive, laughing, playing with her dog, Rocky. Now she was gone, taken by a sudden and severe seizure that no one saw coming. The priest's voice echoed through the church, soft and solemn, but Daniel barely heard the words. His mind was a blur, his heart a shattered mess. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to wake up from this nightmare. But he couldn't. This was real, too real. Then a low, mournful whine cut through the silence. Heads turned, and there, standing at the foot of the coffin, was Rocky. The dog's fur was matted, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the coffin. He pawed at the wood, scratching desperately, his whines growing louder, more frantic. "Rocky, no," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. He moved to pull the dog away, but Rocky refused to budge. The dog's barks now echoed through the church, sharp and urgent, his eyes darting between Daniel and the coffin. The mourners exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, others whispered to one another. But no one moved to stop the dog. There was something about Rocky's behavior, something unsettling, yet impossible to ignore. Daniel's heart raced as he stared at the dog, a strange feeling creeping over him. What if... Before he could finish the thought, the sound of engines roaring outside broke the tension. A group of bikers entered the church, their boots heavy on the floor. They had come to pay their respects. Emma had always loved their visits, their loud bikes and rough laughter bringing her joy. But as they approached, their expressions shifted from somber to alarmed. "What's going on?" Jake, the leader of the group, asked as he strode forward. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The coffin, the dog, the uneasy crowd. "Why is the dog acting like that?" Daniel shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. He won't leave her. It's like he doesn't believe she's gone." Jake's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to the coffin. He placed a hand on the wood, his fingers brushing against the scratches Rocky had left behind. For a moment he hesitated, his mind racing. Then with a sudden, decisive motion, he turned to the funeral attendants. "Open it," he said, his voice firm. The crowd gasped. Daniel's eyes widened in shock. "Jake, what are you—" "Open it," Jake repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If there's even a chance, we have to know." The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, but under Jake's intense gaze, they reluctantly began to unscrew the lid of the coffin. The sound of the screws turning was deafening in the silence, every second stretching into an eternity. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. What if Jake was right? What if... As the lid was lifted, Rocky let out a sharp bark, his body trembling with anticipation. The crowd leaned in, their breaths held, their eyes fixed on the coffin. And then, as the lid was set aside, the impossible happened. Emma's chest rose and fell, a shallow, barely there movement, but unmistakable. She was alive. The church erupted into chaos. Gasps, cries, and shouts filled the air as people surged forward, desperate to see what was happening. Daniel fell to his knees beside the coffin, his hands trembling as he reached for Emma. Her skin was cold, but her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She was alive. She was alive. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, their voice cutting through the noise. The priest, pale and wide-eyed, fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. Jake stood frozen, his face a mix of disbelief and relief, while Rocky barked incessantly, his tail wagging furiously as if he knew he had done something extraordinary. Daniel cradled Emma's face in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Emma, Emma, can you hear me?" His voice was barely a whisper, choked with emotion. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Her breathing was faint, but it was there, a miracle in the truest sense. The bikers sprang into action, clearing a path as the paramedics arrived. They rushed in, their equipment clattering as they assessed Emma's condition. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their grief momentarily replaced by a fragile hope. Daniel hovered nearby, his heart pounding as the paramedics worked. "She's stable, but barely," one of them said, adjusting the oxygen mask over Emma's face. "We need to get her to the hospital now." As they lifted Emma onto the stretcher, Rocky tried to follow, his barks turning into desperate whines. Daniel knelt beside him, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You saved her, boy," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved her." The ambulance sped off, its sirens wailing, leaving the church in a state of shock. The mourners lingered, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. Jake approached Daniel, his usual tough demeanor softened by the weight of what had just happened. "What the hell just happened, Dan?" Jake asked, his voice low. "How is this even possible?" Daniel shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. The doctors said she was gone. They said there was no hope. But Rocky, he knew. He knew she was still here." Jake's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the coffin, now sitting empty and open. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "Someone screwed up. Big time. And we're going to find out who." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. The relief of Emma's survival was quickly overshadowed by a growing anger. How could this have happened? How could they have declared her dead when she was still alive? His hands clenched into fists as he thought about the hospital, the doctors, the negligence that had nearly cost him his daughter. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel stayed behind, staring at the empty coffin. Rocky sat beside him, his head resting on Daniel's leg, as if sensing his turmoil. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, a constant in a world that had just been turned upside down. "We're going to get answers, Rocky," Daniel said quietly, his voice firm. "For Emma, for us." The hospital was a blur of white walls, fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of machines. Daniel sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously as he stared at the clock. Every second felt like an eternity. Emma had been rushed into surgery the moment they arrived, and no one had given him any updates since. Rocky lay at his feet, his head resting on Daniel's shoe, as if trying to offer comfort. Jake sat across from him, his arms crossed, his expression grim. The other bikers had stayed behind at the church, but Jake had insisted on coming. He wasn't just Emma's uncle, he was Daniel's brother-in-law, and despite their rocky history, he wasn't about to let Daniel face this alone. "They'll figure it out," Jake said finally, breaking the silence. "She's strong. She'll pull through." Daniel nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and guilt. He replayed the last few days in his head, searching for something he might have missed. Some sign that Emma wasn't really gone. But there was nothing. The doctors had been so sure. They had told him there was no hope. The sound of footsteps made him look up. A doctor approached, her face unreadable. Daniel stood quickly, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor hesitated, her eyes flickering to Jake before settling back on Daniel. "She's stable," she said carefully, "but it's complicated. The seizure caused significant damage, and her body went into a state of extreme shock. It's possible that her vital signs were so faint that they were undetectable at first. That's why she was declared, well, you know." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "You're telling me you made a mistake?" The doctor's expression softened, but there was no apology in her tone. "It's not that simple. These situations are rare, but they happen. What matters now is that she's alive, and we're doing everything we can to help her recover." Daniel wanted to scream, to demand answers, but he forced himself to stay calm. Emma needed him. He couldn't fall apart now. "Can I see her?" he asked instead. The doctor nodded. "For a few minutes. She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her." Daniel followed her down the hall, Jake and Rocky trailing behind. The ICU was quiet, the only sounds the beeping of machines and the soft hum of ventilators. Emma lay in the center of it all, her small body dwarfed by the bed and the tubes surrounding her. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. Daniel sat beside her, taking her hand in his. It was cold, but he held it tightly, as if he could will his warmth into her. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Rocky whined softly, nudging Daniel's leg with his nose. The dog's eyes were fixed on Emma, his tail wagging faintly, as if he knew she was still fighting. Jake stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "What's the plan, Dan?" he asked after a moment. "You can't just let this slide. Someone screwed up, and they need to answer for it." Daniel didn't look up. "I know," he said quietly, "but right now all I care about is Emma. Once she's stable, once I know she's going to be okay, then we'll figure out the rest." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "All right, but when you're ready, I've got your back, whatever it takes." Daniel didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Emma, on the faint rise and fall of her chest, on the hope that she would wake up soon. But deep down, he knew Jake was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Days passed in a haze of beeping machines, hushed voices, and the sterile smell of the hospital. Daniel barely left Emma's side, surviving on coffee and the occasional sandwich Jake forced into his hands. Rocky stayed close too, the hospital staff making an exception for the dog after hearing how he'd saved Emma's life. The bond between the girl and her dog was undeniable, and no one had the heart to separate them. On the third day, something changed. Daniel was dozing in the chair beside Emma's bed, his head resting on his arms, when he felt a faint movement. His eyes snapped open, and he looked down to see Emma's fingers twitching in his hand. His breath caught in his throat. "Emma," he whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might be imagining it. But then her eyes opened, just a crack, and she let out a soft, groggy sound. Rocky immediately perked up, his tail thumping against the floor as he stood and nudged the bed with his nose. "Emma!" Daniel's voice broke as tears filled his eyes. He squeezed her hand gently, afraid to let go. "Hey, sweetheart. It's me. It's Dad. You're okay. You're safe." Emma blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Daniel reached for the cup of water on the bedside table, holding the straw to her lips. She sipped weakly, her eyes closing again as if the effort had exhausted her. "That's it," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Take your time. You're doing great." A nurse rushed in, alerted by the monitors, and began checking Emma's vitals. "She's waking up," she said, her tone a mix of relief and amazement. "This is a good sign, a really good sign." Daniel barely heard her. His entire world was focused on Emma, on the faint squeeze of her hand in his, on the way her eyes fluttered open again, a little clearer this time. "Dad." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard. "I'm here," he said, his tears falling freely now. "I'm right here, sweetheart. You're okay. You're going to be okay." Rocky whined softly, his tail wagging furiously as he pressed closer to the bed. Emma's gaze shifted to him, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Rocky," she murmured, her voice weak but filled with affection. Daniel laughed through his tears, reaching down to scratch the dog's ears. "Yeah, he's here too. He never left you, Emma. He knew you were still with us." The nurse finished her checks and stepped back, smiling. "I'll let the doctor know she's awake. This is a huge step forward." As she left, Jake appeared in the doorway, his usual tough exterior softened by the sight of Emma awake. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave us quite a scare." Emma's eyes drifted to him, and she managed a faint smile. "Uncle Jake." "Yeah, it's me," he said, stepping closer. "You're one tough cookie, you know that?" Daniel couldn't stop smiling, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude. Emma was awake. She was going to be okay. But as he looked at her, pale, fragile, but alive, he felt a surge of anger. This shouldn't have happened. She shouldn't have been declared dead. She shouldn't have had to fight this hard. Jake seemed to read his thoughts. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, his tone firm. "But for now, let's just focus on her." Daniel nodded, pushing the anger aside. Emma was alive, and that was all that mattered. For now. Emma's recovery was slow but steady. Each day brought small victories, a stronger grip, a clearer voice, a brighter smile. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, calling her progress a miracle. But for Daniel, the relief was tempered by a growing determination. He couldn't shake the anger that had taken root in his chest. Someone had failed his daughter, and he wasn't going to let it go. One evening after Emma had fallen asleep, Daniel stepped out into the hospital hallway, where Jake was waiting. Rocky followed, his tail wagging faintly as he trotted beside Daniel. The dog had become a constant presence, a silent guardian who refused to leave Emma's side. "We need to talk," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. Jake nodded, his expression serious. "I was wondering when you'd bring it up. What's the plan?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. "I want answers. I want to know how they could have declared her dead when she was still alive. I want to know who screwed up, and I want them held accountable." Jake crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "You're talking about a lawsuit." "Damn right I am," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and glanced back at Emma's room. He lowered his tone. "This isn't just about money. This is about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Emma could have been buried alive, Jake, because of their mistake." Jake's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "All right, I know a lawyer, someone who specializes in medical malpractice. He's good, really good. I'll set up a meeting." Daniel hesitated, his anger warring with his fear. What if we lose? What if they cover it up?" Jake straightened, his eyes hard. "We won't lose, not this time, not when it's Emma." The determination in Jake's voice gave Daniel a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Jake had always been a wild card, but when it came to family, he was unwavering. The next day, Jake brought the lawyer to the hospital. His name was Marcus Reed, a sharp-dressed man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened intently as Daniel recounted the events: the seizure, the hospital's declaration of death, the funeral, and Rocky's desperate actions. "This is unprecedented," Marcus said finally, his tone a mix of disbelief and intrigue. "But if what you're saying is true, we have a strong case. Medical negligence, emotional distress, potential wrongful death. If she had been buried, this could be huge." Daniel's stomach churned at the thought, but he nodded. "What do we need to do?" "First, we'll need all of Emma's medical records," Marcus explained. "I'll subpoena them if necessary. We'll also need statements from witnesses, the funeral attendees, the paramedics, anyone who can corroborate what happened. And we'll need to get Rocky evaluated. His behavior could be key in proving that Emma was still alive when she was declared dead." Daniel glanced at Rocky, who was lying at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog looked up, his eyes meeting Daniel's, as if he understood what was being said. "He saved her," Daniel said quietly. "He knew she was still here." Marcus nodded. "Dogs have instincts we can't even begin to understand. If we can prove that, it'll strengthen our case." As Marcus left to begin the legal process, Daniel felt a mix of relief and anxiety. This was it. The fight was beginning. But as he looked back at Emma's room, where she was sleeping peacefully, he knew he had no choice. He had to do this. For her, for Rocky, for every family who might face the same nightmare. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal meetings, medical evaluations, and sleepless nights. Marcus worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and building the case. Emma's medical records revealed a shocking series of oversights, rushed assessments, missed signs of life, and a failure to follow proper protocols. The more Daniel learned, the angrier he became. But he channeled that anger into determination, refusing to back down. Rocky became an unexpected star in the case. A team of animal behavior experts evaluated him, documenting his reactions to Emma and his unusual behavior at the church. Their findings were clear. Rocky had sensed something the doctors had missed. His loyalty and instincts had saved Emma's life, and his story captured the attention of the media. Soon the case was making headlines, with people across the country following Emma's miraculous recovery and the fight for justice. One afternoon, as Daniel sat with Emma in her hospital room, Marcus arrived with news. "We've got a settlement offer," he said, his tone cautious. "It's substantial. They want to avoid a trial." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What's the catch?" "They want us to sign a non-disclosure agreement," Marcus explained. "They don't want this going public." Daniel shook his head immediately. Number, this isn't just about money. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again. If we stay silent, they'll just sweep it under the rug. Marcus nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. I figured you'd say that. I've already drafted a counteroffer. We'll push for a public apology and policy changes at the hospital. If they refuse, we take it to trial. Daniel felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. As Marcus left, Emma looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide with curiosity. Daddy, what's going to happen? Daniel sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We're making sure no one else has to go through what you did, sweetheart. You're so brave, and we're going to make things right. Emma smiled faintly, her trust in him unwavering. Okay, Daddy. Later that evening, Jake stopped by, his usual leather jacket replaced by a more subdued look. He'd been a constant support, helping Daniel navigate the legal battle and keeping his spirits up. How's our girl? He asked, nodding toward Emma, who was now asleep. She's getting stronger every day, Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. And the case is moving forward. We're not backing down. Jake grinned, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. That's what I like to hear. You're doing the right thing, Dan. For Emma and for everyone else. Daniel nodded, his resolve firm. But as he looked at Jake, he felt a pang of guilt. Their relationship had been strained for years. But through all of this, Jake had been there. Steady, loyal, and unwavering. Jake, I just want to say thank you for everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you. Jake's grin softened and he shrugged. Hey, that's what family's for. Besides, Emma's my girl. I'd do anything for her. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through hanging in the air. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of hope. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, and no matter what happened, they were in it together. The trial never happened. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the public outcry over Emma's story, the hospital agreed to Daniel's terms. They issued a public apology, acknowledging their mistakes and vowing to implement new protocols to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The settlement included a substantial financial compensation, but for Daniel, the real victory was knowing that Emma's ordeal had sparked change. Emma continued to recover, her strength returning day by day. She was soon discharged from the hospital, and the first thing she wanted to do was go home. Daniel and Jake worked together to make the house a welcoming place for her return, with Rocky never far from her side. The dog had become a local hero, his story inspiring countless people, and even earning him a special award from an animal welfare organization. One sunny afternoon, Daniel sat on the porch with Emma, watching as she played with Rocky in the yard. Her laughter filled the air, a sound Daniel had once feared he'd never hear again. Jake joined them, carrying a tray of lemonade. She's doing great, Jake said, handing Daniel a glass. You've done an amazing job with her. Daniel smiled, his eyes never leaving Emma. We all have. I couldn't have done it without you, Jake, and without Rocky. Jake chuckled, leaning against the railing. That dog's something else. I still can't believe what he did. Neither can I, Daniel admitted, but I'm grateful every day that he was there. As they watched Emma and Rocky play, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, and Emma's recovery would take time. But they had faced the worst and come out stronger. The bond between father and daughter, the loyalty of a dog, and the support of family had carried them through. You know, Jake said after a moment, this whole thing has made me realize something. Life's too short to hold on to grudges. I'm glad we're doing this together, Dan. For Emma. Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Me too, Jake. Me too. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Daniel called Emma inside. She ran up the steps, Rocky at her heels, and threw her arms around Daniel's waist. I love you, Daddy, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. Daniel hugged her tightly, his heart full. I love you too, sweetheart, more than anything. And as they went inside, the house filled with laughter and the warmth of family, Daniel knew they had been given a second chance, a chance to heal, to grow, and to cherish every moment together.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.